It's my pleasure to introduce Paul Pfeiffer. Paul works in film and photography. He employs recent computer technologies to explore the effect of mass media on human consciousness. He's exhibited at many museums and galleries around the world, including solo shows. I'm just going to list the major solo shows, otherwise it would be a very long introduction. Solo shows at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, the Whitney Museum, the Barbican in London, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin. He's represented by Paul Cooper Gallery here in New York, by Thomas Dane in London, and Carl Jaegerbauer in Berlin. I first saw his work in the 2000 Whitney Biennial, for which he was awarded the inaugural Buxbaum Award. He participated in the 2001 Venice Biennale, and he was a resident at MIT, the List Visual Arts Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he was a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. He received a BFA from the Art Institute in San Francisco and an MFA from Hunter College. He attended the Whitney Independent Study Program, and he recently joined our faculty here in the MFA Fine Arts program at SVA. Please join me in welcoming Paul Pfeiffer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach because I just came back from doing on my first kind of big project in Asia, and the title of this exhibition, which I did in Manila, was Vitruvian Figure, and that's a title that I've been using for almost like 15 years now. And so I wanted to kind of start by unpacking a little bit what the Vitruvian figure is to me. So this first slide, or these first few slides, are not of my work, but it's stuff that I downloaded from the internet. This is the front page of a book called The 10 Books of Architecture, and it is officially the oldest surviving treatise on architecture in the Western tradition. It was written like around the time of Julius Caesar by the architect of the guy who became the sort of the official architect of Julius Caesar, named Vitruvius. And that's where the term Vitruvian figure comes from. Because basically what he did is he, as a gift and to get into the good graces of the Caesar, put together like a manual that was meant to be a kind of primer on statescraft and politics and how to run society for Julius Caesar. And one of the primary kind of subjects of the book is architecture, and the notion of there being some almost like, well, some principles of architecture that were handed down from the past that needed to be understood, and this book encoded them. So, I mean, to me, this book is like not just a book about architecture, but it's really about society. And Vitruvius really is sort of drawing a connection between like the proper proportions of a building, but then its relationship to the proper proportions of society, and even more macro, you know, the proper proportions of the cosmos. Really, it's this idea that like the same principles that rule the gods, rule society, rule the individual body, like everything is sort of nested in on different scales, but in relation to these same set of proportions. And probably the most like famous translation of these ideas is, you know, this like very iconic image by Leonardo da Vinci. This is the Vitruvian figure, and it's just somehow an illustration of the idea that within simple geometric forms, the circle and the square, there is a correspondence with the sort of ideal proportions of the human body, and by association, the ideal proportions of society and so forth. So we just went from basically from zero, or rather first century AD to the 15th the 15th century. And this is another illustration by a different architect around a similar time. This is Ciceriano, another Italian architect of the Renaissance. And you could see it wasn't just Leonardo, it was like everybody on the same sort of mission to interpret Greco-Roman aesthetic ideas with the new sort of methodologies of the Renaissance, sort of the beginnings of well, I guess it's slightly before scientific method, but anyway, there's both an updating and a Christianization of older pre-Christian aesthetic ideas in the Renaissance. And what interests me about these things is that what I see is basically an unbroken, continuous chain that leads up to the present. Another, probably one of the most important figures in this regard is Palladio, Andrea Palladio, who was the guy who most thoroughly re-encoded and translated all of Vitruvius's ideas into a new 10 books on architecture, but his was, I think, the 4 books of architecture, basically encoding everything into an updated form for the Renaissance. And if you've ever heard of Palladian villa or Palladian architecture in general, this was super influential. From there, these ideas spread across Europe. What is his name? Inigo Jones in England then took Palladio's ideas and reinterpreted these for the building of basically all state, all kind of aristocratic buildings in the Baroque were a translation of Palladio's 4 books on architecture. And you can see, inside the book, you basically have illustrations of buildings and both the classical columns and the classical orders handed down basically from antiquity, from centuries before Christ, from Greece, but sort of updated for use and consumption in now the 1600s. This is another sketch shoot. I think this is actually Leonardo da Vinci, but what I wanted to show in this is that one of the primary kind of examples or forms that's found in all of these treatises from Vitruvius onward is the stadium. So basically this is a kind of a sketch based on the Colosseum in Rome. And this is the classical Palladian villa plan. Basically, the Vitruvian figure again, circle and square sort of corresponding as the kind of ground plan for human habitation. This is a picture of one of Palladio's villas. There's a whole series of them around Venice in the Veneto that still stand. So, for centuries, people from wherever, Germany or from different parts of Europe would take the grand tour and would basically come down to Venice to see these. It was considered a part of every artist, every architect's, every musician's, sort of training, if possible, to actually pilgrimage down to see these embodiments of the classical principles of building, which applied to architecture, applied to painting, applied to to music, to everything. This is a picture of Monticello in the United States. So basically you see, again, with folks coming over from Europe to the new, whatever, like the new land, America, they're importing the same ideas. And these, basically, if you look at all of the state buildings of Washington, D.C., and, every state building is based on the principles of classical proportion as set out by Vitruvius and Palladio and that whole lineage. This is Corbusier. So now going into the modern, you see again like a repetition of the circle and square now in this kind of simplified, minimal form, minus all the decoration, but still keeping the same sort of idea of carrying the torch of classical proportion, just modernizing it again. And then Philip Johnson into the postmodern. Again, now the skin is removed, it's just glass and steel skeleton, but it's still the same circle and the square. So, yeah, in a sense, I encountered all of these ideas myself personally in around 1995, 20 years ago, when I happened to pick up this book called Architecture in the Age of Humanism, I think is Whitcower was the author of this book, which just broke down what these proportions were, just what the ideas were encoded in the classical tradition. And what appealed to me is just the idea that, in a sense, what you have is, in architectural terms, a set of ideas that represent kind of Western, the West's image of itself, in a way like Western identity, written in sort of mathematical and aesthetic terms. And the idea that by adopting this language, I could individually, as an artist, enter into this tradition and also sort of play with it, play with the rules and try to break them in order to speak about how Western identity looks to me. So these are some of the first Vitruvian figures that I made myself. They're actually sepia prints or blueprints, and these were made in around 1994, 95, 96, when Mac computers were just coming out, and these were also my first experiments with Photoshop. And what I was basically doing is I wanted to remake these photo collages in Photoshop using as a template the ground plans of major basilicas. So this, for example, is St. Peter's in Rome, specifically the ground plan by Raphael. Since the ground plan, St. Peter's took a long time to build, and there were several iterations and several architects involved before the thing finally got built. Anyway, this was Raphael's plan for St. Peter's, and it's a print that's about 6 feet high, and this is Pavia Cathedral, and basically the way they were made was, the dark areas are meant to be like the walls of the cathedral seen from above, and the dark sort of dots are like the columns. And so I kind of reversed the equation and turned the dark areas into negative space by like basically taking these bits of photographs that I was scanning from magazines, like specifically from porno magazines. Like I had this idea of like these being kind of like body images. So I just thought it would be whatever, a way to, play with it, to actually use, images from porno magazines. So like all the dark areas are sort of lined with mouths and anuses, and basically orifices, sort of like, receiving these phalluses. So the dark areas become these like absent phalluses that are being like sucked on by like mouths. So you have to get like really close up to see them, and then when you for me, they also became like these things become like, images of hell or something. And then around the same time, this was another kind of experiment in Photoshop. This time, these next prints are called the Temple of Solomon, and they're based on, again, a ground plan, like a massive ground plan that was never built, for the recreation of the Temple of Solomon by a Spanish Baroque architect named Villapando. And what I was doing is actually like scanning the scalp of a Barbie doll with all the hair removed from the scalp, and then sort of piecing that together to reform the ground plan for the Temple of Solomon. And this is like late 90s, and I don't know, I just like the idea of this kind of like this plastic body being superimposed onto this sort of like classical body, to create like a cyborg or something. Like in the late 90s, it was like all about the cyborg. And so I did it in different colors. Like this was Ebony Barbie. And then to jump forward to, I think like 2001 or 2002, this is the next photographs are like, for me, a very big jump from different ways of working to like squarely a kind of like appropriation method of working. Like at a certain point, I just, instead of creating my own pictures, I just got this idea that a lot of what I was really trying to do was already in like certain pictures, and just by appropriating those pictures, it was much more straightforward, and it was just a different way of speaking, or like of developing a language as an artist. So I started taking images from the NBA archive and making these photos, like stripping down, like taking off all the team names and numbers and other details. And so this series is called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. I don't know. I mean, you saw the first one. In some ways, not just that literal example, but and all of these, in a way, to me, become kind of like these new sort of like Vitruvian figures. This is a armature of a video, and that is like a very small screen. Because like when I first started playing with video as an extension of like playing with Photoshop, and just starting to play around in around 1999 with software like Premiere and After Effects. I had this idea of using these small monitors or small projectors, since at the time mostly video was shown like super big. So this video is called John 3:16, and it plays on that suspended monitor on a pole. This was actually in the Greater New York show in 2000. And I mean, yeah. The one thing I have to say is 2015 is, so much has happened since from 2000 to 2015. So in a way, it's kind of hard to imagine, this was before, seeing video on cell phones. So in a way, it becomes part of the piece for me that, this thing is like a time capsule as technology has very, very quickly evolved. And sort of, a thing about this that was important to me was that since, I didn't have any background in filmmaking or video making at all. Really, my background is in printmaking, so, I'm coming through Photoshop and video is like an extension of playing with photos in Photoshop. And so there was, I had no skill or interest in making kind of linear narratives in sort of, film school way. And so really everything for me was like a loop and was meant, I thought it would be, it was just, the basic idea of looking at video the way you would look at a painting, where it's sort of detached from any kind of linear progression. It's more like something that, as a viewer, you can decide how long to look and so forth. And so the viewer navigates time, and temporality is kept totally open. So there's another video from the same time, and that's like a little CPJ Sony projector that was like the original mini projector for parties. And I used a mount that I got from a security camera supply on Canal Street and just turned it upside down. So again, it was designed to just, play continually without ever changing, just this loop. And so you would come up to it and see it without, and then go away from it, like a still image in a way. And the first time I showed these, they were shown together, actually, like bookends. So the title of this piece is The Pure Products Go Crazy. And the title of the last one was Fragment of a Crucifixion. And the title of this one is Live Evil. And that's just to show you the way it's projected is by two projectors into a corner. I also want to show you, this is actually, I did a whole series of live evil videos. and they all come from the same place. It's the same. It's a particular Michael Jackson concert that was, performed around the world. So, like, I just like this idea of the same image, but this one I think is like in Malaysia, and the last one was in Bucharest. And he's doing the same thing. He's singing "Stranger in Moscow," and he's doing like the moonwalk. There's like a moment in the middle of that song where he does the moonwalk. And then I just have a couple of more videos to show you. This one is from a triptych called The Long Count, and they're a series of images of famous Muhammad Ali fights. This is the Rumble in the Jungle, and I'm just taking the last knockout round and removing the boxers, so you see like the 3-minute knockout round without the boxers there. But actually, I'm going to go forward. This is another one from that triptych, and this one should have sound. The soundtrack of this piece is actually was a collaboration with an artist named Chris Kubik, and he was taking interviews with with Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, and then picking out the words and leaving just like everything in between the words. So in some ways like a sonic counterpart to what I was doing visually. And just running through these. This is a video called Desiderata. And that's just to show you, it's actually shown on like a little portable DVD player. So actually really small. Are you referring to the image? Yeah, the images all come from The Price is Right. But then, I sort of expanded the stage set by like doubling the stage set to make it sort of bigger. I think this is like the last thing I have to show you. This is a video that I did in 2001, and it was a commission by the Public Art Fund, and it was a 2.5-month long video that played in the World Trade Center. I think it was like one of the last artworks to be shown in the World Trade Center. And it was called Orpheus Descending, and it was basically the image of like the life cycle of a flock of chickens, or like a pen of chickens that was shot. I mean, the chickens were grown upstate, free range, and shot in a kind of natural setting, and they were shot in real time using like a security camera, a number of security cameras hooked up to a switcher, so it would like switch angles every few seconds. And so it was like, it was just like this real time image of these chickens living and whatever, eating and sleeping over a 2.5-month, over the span of their lives, basically. And then the idea was to play back this 2.5-month video in real time in the corridors of the World Trade Center, so that basically, the audience for it would be all the commuters going in and out of the building day by day. So, it was for a very specific captive audience. And so I just wanted to show you, this is like, like highlights from the video. Like this is, the first 2 weeks were just images of the eggs incubating and then hatching, and then probably like another, like 2 weeks take place in the chick pen, and then the last 6 weeks all happen outdoors, where you see like the chickens basically do their daily thing. And so, the idea is if you went at midnight, you would see the chickens sleeping. If you went like early, like right around rush hour in the morning, you would see them like, like sort of jumping to catch insects in the air. The images, we got permission from Bloomberg to use some of the monitors that usually show advertising. And they're sort of positioned above these hallways where people are walking through. So you would, you wouldn't really be able to like stop and watch it. You would just always like watch it for a few seconds as you were walking to work or like coming back from work and heading for the subway. It started on Easter Sunday and then ran for 2.5 months, which I thought, just gave it like a playful but also like a religious, symbolic dimension to it. And it wouldn't have looked like this. You're really seeing like short pieces from, but really like there would be much less happening. Okay, actually I just realized I have a couple more things. This, yeah, well, this is a piece called Empire, and it was basically inspired by Orpheus Descending, and in this case, this is the life cycle of a wasp nest that was shot in Georgia in real time using like a digital recorder, and this is more like what you would see, like basically close to nothing. Like now the queen is just, I don't know, doing like maybe tending an egg or a larva. And so this piece now runs for 3 months, Unlike the previous piece, it was meant to be portable, and now it's like housed in this, in a case. And I just like the idea of this being a kind of an object that is where the presence of it actually comes from this sculptural box rather than the video itself, and the video becomes like sort of not viewable except in tiny fragments where nothing in particular happens. But cumulatively, over 3 months, you actually have the full, like this amazing story of like, like grubs turning into wasps and wasps being born out of these cells, and like the whole life of like a colony. I also like the idea that, wasps being sort of like, like this kind of like vermin type creature, but always in proximity to humans. This is like a paper wasp. So basically the paper wasp makes its nest out of like bits of newspaper. So it's really like an animal only found around humans. And so that actually, so the way I wanted to end this is to show you a couple of very new things. And this first one is called Vitruvian Figure. And in the last few years, I've been engaged in going back to the Vitruvian Figure in sculptural form now. And so this is a piece that was originally shown at the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin as part of a bigger installation, which was a sound installation. And anyway, it was basically a quarter stadium sandwiched between one-way mirrors. So like basically if you, from one particular angle, you could look over the rim and see the full stadium composed from the actual wooden 1/4 stadium reflected in these mirrors to create like a whole stadium. Yeah. And this is part of a bigger installation. I won't tarry on it, but I do want to just put it in context. The way that this series of works was sort of choreographed at Hamburger Bahnhof, you started out seeing the wasp nest, and then you saw this, and then you entered into this big room that was empty, but like is lined with speakers that recreate in sort of 3 dimensions the sound of this football crowd. But I feel like it's too much to go into it, so I'm going to sort of skip through it. And then show you another Vitruvian figure, which was commissioned for the Sydney Biennial in 2008. And it was really like, in a way, the most interesting part of it. Well, it was a collaboration with a architect called BVN. They built the Sydney Olympic Stadium, and they agreed to like basically hand over their plans for Sydney Olympic Stadium, and then let me work with some of their designers to expand the Sydney Olympic Stadium, which was a 100,000 seat stadium, into a 1 million seat stadium. Basically like expand it 10 times into like a theoretical 1 million seat stadium, which is, never existed, but actually, was plans for such a thing were made by the Nazis. And then we took this plan to Manila, which in the last few years I've started kind of like working there because I just like the idea of having a studio, using a city like Manila as a studio. And so put together a team to actually produce a model of this 1 million seat stadium. And so these are just like some images of the team. No, this was done in 2008. It was like, constructed over a period of like 3 months, then shipped to Sydney, shown once. Like, it was very jerry-rigged. Like, the whole thing was extremely delicate. It was like it was like 28 feet across. This giant piece of jewelry. It was only ever shown once. It was like magically collected by this crazy Brazilian collection called Inhotim. It's like this like major industrialist in Brazil who like has built this sort of like theme park museum in the Amazon and has like crazy projects out there. And then this piece I just finished. This is again a piece produced in Manila, and it's part of the show that I was telling you about. And in this case, it's a half stadium that's bisected by a mirror wall. And so the idea is like basically as you walk around it, you always see the completed, what appears like the completed amphitheater. But it's always partially composed of a reflection. I wish I could show you, there was a second part to this production, which is a 2-channel video, and I will just have to wait for an opportunity to do that in the future because I don't have documentation of it yet. But maybe, a little later I could tell you a little bit more about this because it's very particular. It's basically a model of a mega church that just opened its doors in the Philippines, and currently is the biggest indoor theater in the world. 60,000 seats in an amphitheater form. So like there's a stage and then there's like 60,000 seats. Yeah, and kind of amazing to me that this largest theater in the world is actually a church. Again, like no time to talk about it really, but I just wanted to show this. This is another recent sculpture from 2012 called The Playroom. And in a sense, just in terms of abstract form, I think of it as another Vitruvian figure. It's not, actually. Yeah, this is, it's a model of it's about 6 feet wide. And it's a model of a real piece of architecture, which is like a notorious or a famous room from a 1970s mansion, a sunken living room from the mansion of Wilt Chamberlain in LA. And so actually what I want to do from here is just to show you one last video, which is like super fresh off. I mean, I just finished it. And it's part of, again, this exhibition that I have up right now in Manila. And I'm very excited about it because it represents just like a new kind of departure for me. And it's called Boomerang, and it's sort of a re-performance of performance from 1974, Richard Serra and Nancy Holt. And this is like apparently one of the first live broadcast performances in, the history of video art or performance art. It was performed in a TV recording studio in Texas in 1974 and broadcast live. So if you like turned to the public TV channel in like Austin, Texas in 1974, you would see this thing happening live from like some recording studio somewhere.
Yes, I can hear my echo. And the words are coming back on in top of me. The words are spilling out of my head, and then returning into my ear. It puts a distance between the words and their apprehension or their comprehension. The words coming back seem slow. They don't seem to have the same forcefulness as when I speak them. I think it's also slowing me down. I think that it makes my thinking slower. I have a double take on myself. I am once removed from myself.
So that's the original, and I downloaded it from YouTube, where you can find it, and then I engaged a group of college students in Manila to reperform it, using a group recitation technique, which is found in schools in the Philippines as part of it's a class called oral communication, and it's a way of practicing self-presentation on a stage, and also I basically co-taught a class in oral communication as a way to create this performance, and so I'm just going to show you the result.
Yes, I can hear. Mine. Echo. And the words are coming back on top of me. The words are spilling out of my head and then returning into my ear. It puts a distance between the words and their apprehension or their comprehension. The words coming back seem slow. They don't seem to have the same forcefulness as when I speak them. I think it's also slowing me down. I think that it makes my thinking slower. I have a double take on myself. I am once removed from myself.
It goes on, but I'm going to leave it there. So that's it. I'm going to play this last video and just let it run because it's silent, and it's about 15, 20 minutes video. That's it. That's my presentation.
My question is, I guess your videos, the ones that are on a loop, were pre-meme, but now looking at them without I guess obviously the context of you and what your work is about and when it was made, but how now looking back on it, do you see it intersecting with meme culture or not, or is that something you reject? Or
Yeah, no, you know what? I usually, I usually think of them in relation to GIFs.
GIFs. Oh yeah, are those not?
Because they're like,
GIFs and
GIFs are
different.
moving. But
Sorry.
actually, I think meme is like a really good, because, I always, in some ways, no, I don't reject it at all. I think in some ways, I've always been interested in how working with videos in this way relates to advertising, and I think memes relate to advertising. Somehow, like the idea that you could capitalize on the way that people naturally consume or like absorb images, which is intuitively first, and in a way like non-didactically, like a thing imprints itself on your brain and becomes memorable, in a sense like visually rather than as a matter of ideology. So in some sense I've always thought of like advertising working this way, and I've always been interested in how like working with images myself, and wanting to make memorable images, one could somehow play with those principles from advertising. And what your question makes me think is that in some ways we've all adopted this the kind of the methodology of advertising, in the sense that we all kind of like exchange ideas via memes now. I also think in some ways there's a relationship between memes and some like I'm not an expert in this at all, but at least the principles, if you subscribe to them, of hypnosis.
From your videos of like the basketball games and like Michael Jackson's concerts, I wasn't sure if you wanted to go off of the topic of like spirituality and like religion, or I wasn't sure if you wanted to explore that in your videos.
Well, yeah, I guess I'm interested in I've used a lot of biblical titles and biblical or religious references. One thing is that there is this, what happened in the Renaissance was a literal Christianization of these, to my mind, like really kind of fundamental aesthetic ideas. So in a sense, like the religious dimension has always been there, and if anything, it becomes it becomes part of the appropriation in taking up certain forms. But then I also feel like religion circulates in popular culture in really strong ways, and in a way to just I'm interested in evoking a religious dimension because of it. I think it's because I think it's such a strong aspect of pop culture. Well, the title of this video is Morning After the Deluge, which is taken from a painting by Turner, but then is a reference to the story of Noah's Ark and the biblical flood. And it's in a way, well, the morning after the deluge would be like the morning after the complete annihilation of the world. And I think part of it is also that I think pop culture and media culture is literally awash with images that have to do with the end of the world. ISIS exists because it's almost the end of the world. You know what I'm saying? That's the rationale for ICE's whole project. So, in very, very aggressive ways, notions of biblical proportion and of Armageddon are front and center in pop culture now.
I guess what I wanted to say, was that intentional, or like you exploring religion, was that intentional or no?
I mean, to politicize it, for me, appropriation and playing with images from pop culture, it has to do with some idea that that images are being used to really stoke very potentially destructive ideas. The sort of us versus them, sort of mindset is, regularly being promoted through images now, and I don't know, just very retrograde ideas of what belonging is supposed to be, and kind of who the enemy is, and I don't know, just attempts at sort of just defining social order through very kind of crass and in crass and destructive terms. That's, I feel, in some ways the primary usage of images. So to take these images is to really seek some alternative, or to promote some other understanding. And I mean, in a sense, to go back to the Vitruvian figure idea, and this connects with what you're saying about playing with religious titles and references. It's very intentional. It's not accidental at all, and it's about an understanding that in some ways, there has we're really that what the Vitruvian figure represents is this prolonged engagement and attachment to very simple forms to describe human relationships and society, and the kind of fundamental ideas of what how we are and how we live together, and that that in some ways these very simple forms are a misinterpretation, and they can easily be appropriated to mean very destructive things. Symmetry easily becomes some very nationalistic idea of me versus, or us versus them, and the annihilation of them in order to create the fulfillment or the wholeness of us. And so for me, it's about a rejection of that, of these very destructive forms of the interpretation, the misinterpretation, I would say, of these very fundamental ancient aesthetic principles that, for better or worse, we continue to live with. And I don't know, as a way to look at them and experientially to unpack them. Sorry, that's wow.
Thanks. So I feel like a lot of your work, not all of it, but a lot of it deals with spectacle. Athletes, Michael Jackson, huge stadiums, churches, even the sunset. Maybe not the chickens and the insects, but and it's seeing it all together is causing me to rethink my understanding of spectacle. I had tended to think of it in terms of Guy Debord and this idea of a kind of image that exists in an economy of images, and your work deals with that. But it also deals, I think, with and maybe it was your talk about the Vitruvian body and classical architecture with power and a way that certain kinds of images organize us into collectivities and hierarchies. Do you think much about spectacle in relation to your work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes. I always have. I think about. I mean, in a way, a primary kind of like scene for my work is the stadium, and I've always been, like attracted to the stadium because, I think of it as the kind of, I mean, it's a piece of architecture that is emblematic of contemporary society. And in a way, it's just, in a way, to me, a stadium is like a giant broadcast studio. And, sort of one of the primary sites for the use of video. So, there's also like an interest in like the history of image making and the history of video that leads me to that site. And I guess I've always thought that at least there's a potential that in working in the context of contemporary art, that you're not dealing with a stadium situation. You're dealing with a very different condition of viewing. And I always imagine these images that refer to the stadium are actually ultimately only viewed in small numbers, in a very sort of quiet situation that's divorced from the craziness of image consumption in an arena. So it was really about that, moving the spectacle from a space of immersion, and where it is controlling you more than you controlling it, to this other situation which is quieter in a sense, the viewing space of art to me is like a laboratory where you are afforded a space to step back and reflect and to meditate on what you're consuming. So there was this idea from the start that moving spectacle into this other space would create a very different kind of situation. It was a way to comment on it, because it was because of the distance from the actual sites of spectacle. I'm now thinking about I just came back from the art fair in Hong Kong, and in some ways the line between the two is super blurred. So I don't have a full answer for your question.
I think we maybe have time for one more question.
So I guess in the exploration of your work, you often, you're talking about the Vitruvian figure, and I guess in architecture and I guess the study of human proportions, it's kind of in some way a reach towards perfection, and this idea of perfect proportion to the cosmos and to the earth and to relation. But I guess on some level, some of the videos with the athletes and Ali and that fight, and then Michael Jackson, it could be perceived that in the work, in calling those figures Vitruvian or talking about them in that construct, could be seen as perfection being the black body, and then perfection as far as mind being the white mind. So in that kind of contrast, could you talk about how you
source the material you choose to use for your videos? Yeah. Well, all of these images are coming from scenes of arenas and specifically like sports. And to address what you're pointing to directly, there's obviously a racial aspect to these scenes, meaning, like a basketball game or, any like professional sports event. I would answer your question in the same way as, the questions about religion. Like, I'm not so much trying to, take a, like an unambiguous position in regards to religion or race. I have my own personal views, but I also, to me, art is not about like, like promoting your personal views of things. To me, it's much more interesting, to approach art as a matter of, like creating images that, where like meaning becomes a question, more than like a definitive answer. So, all I can say about like this binary of like black body and white mind is that, in a sense, you're talking about Cartesian dualism, and this is a very old idea, and in a sense, it's an idea that I'm extremely critical of, in the same way that I'm critical of like notions of like, perfect bodies or perfect societies or perfect anything. Like, to me, the whole point is to really unpack the notion of entities, whether they be societies or bodies or individuals, being whole in any way. Like, this is each one of these images presents a visual contradiction. It's the opposite of wholeness, and in a way, I'm presenting these ideas visually, to counteract like what I see as the kind of false, beliefs in wholeness as a transparent, like natural thing. Yeah, in some ways, there's a direct connection between like, the kind of identification with race and the identification with nation, with nationalism. And these are like super big subjects, I'm trying to, find like, I'm finding ways to speak about these things in relation to the language of architecture, and, that's why I sort of focus on the Vitruvian figure. I feel like there's ways to approach this that I hope don't get embroiled in like, in a way sort of like superficial debate about, like the problems of society, because, this tends to get stuck on like a certain level. And to me, like these subjects go very, very, very deep.
It's my pleasure to introduce Paul Pfeiffer. Paul works in film and photography. He employs recent computer technologies to explore the effect of mass media on human consciousness. He's exhibited at many museums and galleries around the world, including solo shows. I'm just going to list the major solo shows, otherwise it would be a very long introduction. Solo shows at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, the Whitney Museum, the Barbican in London, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin. He's represented by Paul Cooper Gallery here in New York, by Thomas Dane in London, and Carl Jagenbauer in Berlin. I first saw his work in the 2000 Whitney Biennial, for which he was awarded the inaugural Buxbaum Award. He participated in the 2001 Venice Biennale, and he was a resident at MIT, the List Visual Arts Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he was a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. He received a BFA from the Art Institute in San Francisco and an MFA from Hunter College. He attended the Whitney Independent Study Program, and he recently joined our faculty here in the MFA Fine Arts program at SVA. Please join me in welcoming Paul Pfeiffer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm gonna, these things is that what I see is basically like an unbroken, continuous chain that leads up to the present. Another, probably like one of the most important figures in this regard is Palladio, Andrea Palladio, who was the guy who most thoroughly re-encoded and translated all of kind of like Vitruvius's ideas into a kind of a new 10 books on architecture, but his was, I think, the 4 books of architecture, basically encoding everything into like an updated form for the Renaissance. And if you've ever heard of like, you know, Palladian villa or, you know, Palladian architecture in general, this was like super, super influential. From there, it basically, these ideas spread across Europe. What is his name? Inigo Jones in England then took Palladio's ideas and reinterpreted these for like the building of basically all, you know, all state, all kind of aristocratic buildings in the Baroque. Were a translation of Palladio's 4 books on architecture. And you can see, like inside the book, you basically have illustrations of buildings and both the classical. Take a little bit of a different approach because I just came back from doing on my first kind of big project in Asia, and the title of this exhibition, which I did in Manila, was Vitruvian Figure, and that's a title that I've been using for almost like 15 years now. And so I wanted to kind of start by unpacking a little bit what the Vitruvian Figure is to me. So this first slide, or these first few slides are not of my work, but it's stuff that I downloaded from the internet. This is the front page of a book called The 10 Books of Architecture. And it is officially the oldest surviving treatise on architecture in the Western tradition. It was written like around the time of Julius Caesar by the architect of the guy who became the sort of the official architect of Julius Caesar, named Vitruvius. And that's where the term Vitruvian Figure comes from. Because basically what he did is he, as a gift and to get into the good graces of the Caesar, put together like a manual that was meant to be a kind of Leonardo da Vinci. This is the Vitruvian Figure. And it's just somehow an illustration of the idea that within simple geometric forms, the circle and the square, there is a correspondence with the sort of ideal proportions of the human body. And by association, you know, the ideal proportions of society and so forth. So we just went from basically from 0, or rather first century AD to the 15th the 15th century. And this is another illustration by a different architect around a similar time. This is Cesariano, another Italian architect of the Renaissance. And you could see it wasn't just Leonardo. It was like everybody on the same sort of mission to interpret Greco-Roman aesthetic ideas with the new sort of like methodologies of the Renaissance, like, you know, sort of the beginnings of like, well, I guess it's slightly before scientific method, but anyway, there's both like an updating and a Christianization of like older pre-Christian aesthetic ideas in the Renaissance. And what interests me about primer on statescraft and politics and how to run society for Julius Caesar. And one of the primary kind of subjects of the book is architecture, and the notion of there being some almost like, well, some principles of architecture that were handed down from the past that needed to be understood, and this book encoded them. So, I mean, to me, this book is like not just a book about architecture, but it's really about society, and Vitruvius really is sort of drawing a connection between like the proper proportions of a building, but then its relationship to the proper proportions of society, and even more macro, you know, the proper proportions of the cosmos. Really, it's this idea that like the same principles that rule the gods, rule society, rule the individual body, like everything is sort of nested in on different scales, but in relation to these same set of proportions. And probably the most like famous translation of these ideas is, you know, this like very iconic image by